we will be discussing today how to maximize your church's effectiveness in disciple making. So again, my name is Mike Gamble, Senior Lead Navigator. With me here today is Dr. Clint Grider. Of all the accolades on the Exano team, and there are many, Clint is singular. He brings one that no one else brings, and that is he has a Baylor certified PhD in organizational leadership, and he brought that strategic experience with him and experience in research. He brings that to all of his clients, specifically in the area of disciple making, asking the question of how we can mind the gap between what we do and the outcomes in people's lives. If you've been in ministry for more than a hot minute, you know that sometimes you can be disappointed when all of our effort doesn't yield more fruit. And Jesus called us to that fruit. So that is the topic of today. And it just seems like as we go into ministry and as our new millennium just progresses, it seems like this is getting more complicated and more difficult, even by the day. And so Clint is the proud new author of a new book called Mind the Gap, Closing the Gap in Disciple Making, How to Discover 2 Critical Health Indicators to Maximize Your Church's Effectiveness. So before I turn it over to Clint, I just want to ask him to talk about the book. I just want to ask him one quick question. You know, Clint, writing a book is a big deal. It's even a calling. And so I just really quick, just in 30 seconds, what did God put in your heart? What passion ignited this desire to write a book?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us today. You know, we live in this world. You were starting to talk about it. We live in a world that is changing so rapidly that in so many cases we need an opportunity to know if what we're spending time on is having the greatest impact. And in so many cases, over many years of working with churches and other organizations, there are aspects of organizational behavior, of group dynamics, of process improvement that are so biblical, and yet often we don't apply those in settings to be able to know how do we actually make the best right choices given our specific context, and how do we know that we're multiplying discipleship making in a powerful way. And so that really motivated the kind of that angst of the need to dig deeper into those kind of things.
Yeah, I love that. As we think about just this era of rapid discontinuous change, it just feels like we're always changing. How do people think about that? Is there a way that you approach that as you went to write the book?
Yeah, there's an interesting, for those of you who've been to London, you might recognize the term mind the gap. The London Underground is the oldest, largest subway system in the world, and a pretty fascinating system. And it has kind of some quirks where there are some stations, some platforms at stations that line up against curved parts of the rail, or sometimes the rail is higher or lower than the platform. And so as you go into these stations, you hear this phrase booming over the speakers, mind the gap. And it's printed everywhere, but it really is this idea that you've got to be careful of these gaps if you're going to be safe. And you've also got to be careful of these gaps if you're going to make progress toward your journey. And so I found it to be a pretty fascinating metaphor for really the church and the church underground, this whole system of trains and stations leading people to destinations on their journey. So we're going to spend some time talking about that shortly and how that metaphor helps us think about what we're doing in church life.
I love that. I don't have an underground where I'm from in Montana. I don't think there are any undergrounds anywhere in the state, but I've been to London, and I do know that it's one of the best ways to get around other than just walking 5 miles. So as we jump into the book, Clint, this idea you've shared with me before, and I know you didn't make it up, but you're sharing it with us, this idea that we're in a VUCA world. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the idea that we are in a VUCA world, the idea of VUCA is something that is not new. Many of you may have heard of this term, and it's this concept in organizational behavior that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So living in a VUCA world means that we're in rapid change, that most people can feel this. Most leaders say, you know what, I can feel the volatility, I can feel the uncertainty and just the complexity. And yet the need for the gospel feels more critical than ever before, doesn't it? Even though it's more complex than ever before, in a world where faith is being constructed, deconstructed by so many, there's mistrust of institutions, and really the marked decline of evangelism screams to us the question, what are we doing? Do we know we're doing the right things? And so it really leads to these common struggles that many church leaders experience. The way we teach discipleship, plan discipleship, and sustain discipleship. And so playfully, we, looking at some of these metaphors, we teach discipleship often like it's more of a philosophy class instead of a shop class. I had a pastor once tell me, if we're honest, we impress with our theological teaching, but aren't making practical, hands-on disciple making the norm. We can get a few on board. We do initiatives, we do all kinds of things. We get a few people on board, but seem to have a fundamental inability to get the widespread majority of our people doing it as a natural outflow of their life. And worse yet, we have trouble recognizing what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. And some of our leaders even get defensive when we try to address that. That differs greatly from more of this idea of a shop class of being hands-on with apprentices, digging deeper and multiplying disciple making. We often, a lot of times in church leadership, plan discipleship more like squirrels on a street instead of ants on a hill. Do you ever feel like a squirrel running back and forth, running from one thing to the next in the middle of the street, having to react to urgent stuff and trying your best not to get hit by a car? Hopefully, does it ever feel like that sometimes in ministry? Instead of having the space to be a thoughtful team working closely together, interdependently, going high and low, deep to excavate beneath the surface to figure out what's really going on, to have the foundation we really need to know where our people are, and then why to spread out over long distances in all kinds of environments. And then we often sustain discipleship more like a traveling circus instead of a theme park. So does it ever feel sometimes like you or your ministry teams are functioning more like event managers, focused on one thing and then packing up and moving on to the next thing, versus designing an approach that's interconnected and far more intentional and engaging people in a bigger story, in a more thematic story that's really God's story from where they are now as a long-term investment. But, if we're honest, sometimes we feel like we're moving from thing to thing instead of having a way to connect them in a deeper, more meaningful way with long-term fruit. And so this is really,
I love these analogies, Clint. They're fun and we can connect to them emotionally. Sometimes we feel like that squirrel, up, the squirrel, and we're just going all over the place. And as we engage this as pastors, I know that one of my mentors taught me early 30 years ago that pastoring is a little bit like herding cats, right? And so we've all heard that before, but when you think about 5 or just a handful of those features that really characterize biblical leadership, why don't you walk us through those so that we can move from this idea of squirrel but to a more organized, productive way of making disciples?
Yeah, so there's interesting. So I've done a lot of study into the ideas of occupations in Scripture, and many of us teach from this often. I mean, there's so much that Jesus talks about that Scripture shares with us about ancient shepherding and farming and building and fishing. And yet there's many of us who can't completely relate to it because it looks very different today than it did. But when you look at it contextually and you start looking at the ties between these different occupations, you see these 5 things rush to the surface. You see patterned, repeated activity. There's things that are emphasized again and again. there's rhythms. There are certain functions that are repeated over and over. A second tie in them is there's keen observation and great attention to detail. Um, if you don't come to ministry with the ability to kind of read the clouds, taste the soil, smell the wind, recognize blemishes, measure the gradient of the land. There's all of this great specificity as you dig into these ancient occupations. That's extremely important. That people, when Scripture was written, would have recognized. Thirdly, there's this ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And again, as I mentioned before, we sometimes struggle with that in church ministry. But the world in general is predictable in terms of its physical laws, but it's unpredictable in terms of what will happen when. And so it requires this ability to be nimble, to be agile, to maximize our effectiveness. And then there's also this beautiful handing down of practical knowledge. So no one's on their own. Everyone is initiated into this kind of accumulation of wisdom and experience and practice and engaging one with another. And you see that in the methods of these ancient occupations. And then finally, I think it's a really important point. They embody a system, not systems. So if you were to look at machinery that involves the interplay of different systems, that is not what the Bible teaches in terms of these occupations, and it's not what they demonstrate. It's more of this interdependent whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. It represents ultimately the body of Christ on mission, but so many times in ministry, if we're honest again, we have this reality where we have different silos and different systems kind of functioning on their own and sometimes trying to play well together versus having a way to look at all of it as an interdependent system, one system, not systems. You know, this really leads us to what I believe the root of the problem is in ministry today when we take all of this into consideration. Never has there been a greater disconnect between God's desired outcomes, people's life journeys, and what they experience through church. The kinds of outcomes that the Bible talks about, what are the outcomes in our context that we're going for? What are the sensitivities in people's minds and hearts? What are the competencies, the kind of next step intentionality that we're really seeking? And how does that intersect with where they really are today, which so many times we don't know? and then how does the church intersect with that? It's the disconnect between the outcomes in people's life journeys and what they experience through church. And ultimately, the reason for this is that we have two critical gaps in ministry as leaders: the awareness gap and the connectivity gap. And these are the gaps that the book really helps us to dig into, that gives us the kind of flexibility and the agility that we need in the kind of environment that we're ministering in today. Let's start with the awareness gap. This is the gap between what we think is happening in people as a result of our efforts and what is actually happening. So it's this fascinating dynamic. Many leaders admit to not truly knowing how most people in their churches are growing and struggling spiritually, or how they're struggling with maximizing disciple making or sharing their faith. They know about some. Every good leader has some stories and some people they're connected with, but they don't know about all. And this can lead to a lot of false assumptions, because leaders who don't close this gap default to leading by assumption. So here's what this looks like. Many times in ministry, we will tend to say, gosh, if we could just get more people attending or participating in something, that's going to be a good thing. And the reality is that is a good thing. We want more people participating and engaging with us in the kinds of things that we're doing. But I think as leaders, all of us intuitively know that just because somebody shows up or participates, that doesn't automatically mean that they're growing spiritually, right? That doesn't automatically mean that they're moving the needle. The needle is being moved in their life towards something more specific. And so then what we do is we say, well, let's share some stories. Let's find some beautiful spotlighted stories of ways to get a feel for what God is doing in some people's lives. And so once again, hey, that's a beautiful thing. There is this assumption that comes into play where when we hear a few of these stories, we assume that it's happening across the board, which may or may not be the case. And so here's a fundamental question I often ask leaders. Let's say we're a church of 500, and you could literally put someone on the platform every single week of the year, sharing a testimony of what God is doing in his or her life. And again, we praise God for that. That is awesome. We want to share stories like that. The problem comes if we don't have a way to move from that 10% to the rest of the congregation. And so many times I'll ask that question: are you evaluating your church's effectiveness by the 10% who are testifying to a changed life, or by the 90% who aren't? The idea of spotlighting is phenomenal for communication, but terrible for overall evaluation. Let's move to the connectivity gap. This is the gap between misconnected steps or ministries that short circuits their effectiveness. And so the connectivity gap, it's interesting. A couple of different reasons. I didn't use the word connection here because connection is the act of connecting. So someone could feel connected because they have a friend or two, but it's not this kind of ongoing state of being connected in the larger mission or approach of the entire organization. So connectivity is more of this state of being connected interdependently in that way. And when we talk about this gap between misconnected steps or activities, misconnection means a wrong, faulty, or inadequate connection of things. So in part, this gap might be the variety of things a person might do or hear about through church that for whatever reason don't seem connected to them. So in your churches, have you ever had a situation where there are people who are involved in some things? They've got some relationships and they find a few things they like and they lean into that, but you still kind of wonder, where is that really taking them spiritually? And how do we maximize disciple making? Is that really doing it? But for some reason, they're not engaging or connecting the dots into that larger mission together. But the reality that we have to be attentive to is that people who are struggling with that do not have a way. Hang on, a little technical difficulty here. There we go. They don't have a way to take their next step in most cases because we haven't given them the right next step to take. And this onus is on us as leaders. It takes much more intentionality to determine where people actually are on their journeys, and then to figure out how do we connect them with the right next steps that make sense to them. Because for a lot of people, what looks like a step to us or a very logical step to us feels like a puzzling leap to them. And some of this relates to us jumping from thing to thing in our churches, right? Again, have you ever felt in your churches, or even in the research you've done or stuff you've heard from other churches that you've tried to apply in your context, and there's kind of, well, let's try this model, or let's try that model, or let's try this idea, or let's try that idea. And even though we're excited about it and we think we're kind of doing it to try, what happens is people start to they sort of tune us out a little bit because it feels to them like a tennis match where they're just looking back and forth. Okay, here's the latest greatest thing. Now it's something else that is the latest greatest thing. I'm just going to lean into the stuff that I like, which only emphasizes this kind of consumeristic posture almost at times. And so how this lives itself out is we could plead with people to engage in missional community. We could plead with them, hey, get in this smaller group or get in this training environment to learn how to make disciples. And they smile and they nod and they say, way to go, Pastor, but they're really not living it. It seems to fall on deaf ears. And so how do we pay attention to these two gaps? And so this is where I want us to kind of go to the metaphor of the underground that I think is very, very helpful to us in looking at this overall this overall process. And really, it's kind of a fresh way to look at what we're doing. So, if you look at a railway system like the London Underground, there are three main components: trains, stations, and destinations. Trains represent what I call constants. These are the ongoing things that we're doing in our churches. So every church on the planet has some things that you're doing in an ongoing way. There's perpetual movement around them. It's an opportunity for people to engage regularly. And so I call those constants. And these can be things like organized activities that people engage in regularly, something like worship, or if your church has various forms of groups, whether they're serving groups or connection groups. That would be another example, because most churches have those in an ongoing way. It also can relate to those personal habits that we're praying, that we're shepherding people toward to get engaged in their own lives. So these can be personal, ongoing habits, or they can be more of the group things we're doing in church on mission together as the body of Christ. So that is what constants are. That's what the trains represent. Now, in terms of stations, stations represent this concept of what I call waypoints. And waypoints give us this beautiful picture of how do we point people to the right trains based on where they are and based upon where we're headed on the journey. And so if we're doing a good job in designing our waypoints, they're going to help people to get on the right trains for their lives. And so think of this in terms of the shorter term things we do. So this could be special events. This could be perhaps restoration ministries. It could be something that we actually design as an initiative or a campaign, so to speak, for a period of time. Maybe it's 40 days of prayer, or 40 days with an emphasis on a certain topic, or leaning into something in the community for a period of time. But the idea here is that there are always waypoints that we're providing. The problem is if they're not pointing the way to the right train. And this is where you see issues with the connectivity gap, is we can do events, we can do wonderful restorative kinds of ministries. Maybe those go on for 4 or 6 weeks or a little bit longer, but again, they're not intended to go ongoing for the rest of someone's life. But if they don't point people to the right trains to get them closer to the destinations that we're seeking, then we're not doing a good job. That's where the connectivity gap shows up, and they feel like disconnected steps to people. And then we have destinations. And so I call these journey outcomes, or outcomes for short. And so these are, as I referenced earlier, these are the kinds of competencies that we're actually going for in someone's life. This represents the very practical fruit. What is it that we're going to see nurturing, growing, showing up more in the way people think, in the way they process their relationships, in the fruits of the Spirit that get very, very practical day by day? Because we all are on a journey towards something greater. God is sanctifying us. His Spirit is sanctifying us. He's growing us. He's moving us towards something in this life, and towards something greater. And so if we have a clearer way to say, what are the specific kinds of outcomes? And I'll share with you how to do that here in just a moment. It gets beautifully specific. How can we lean into these so we know where we're headed? If we don't know where we're headed, if we don't know the ways our different ministries, our different waypoints and constants are supposed to connect with one another, leading to a certain destination, then we're not going to be making meaningful progress. It's going to feel much more haphazard. And so in the absence of clarity of stations, working with trains, leading to specific destinations, these are the kinds of things that our people are experiencing.
I don't love these pictures, Clint. Folks by themselves, access. I don't know if you've ever showed up to go to a meeting before and you get the sign on the door, the meeting's not tonight, it's closed, or oh, it was canceled and it was your first time, so they didn't know to tell you, there's no one there. And that circle train makes me just want to stop and just quit. Like how many of our, that's just so gut wrenching, right? I do all this work and I go nowhere.
We don't want you to quit, Mike. But in it something is it, doesn't it feel like that sometimes? It's not what we're going to talk about from the platform, obviously, right, publicly, but in our hearts, sometimes do we wonder if people are on certain trains and they're just kind of going in circles? Or I was with a leadership team one time, and they were laughing, and they said, "Yeah," or the famous theologian Kenny Rogers, you're on a train bound for nowhere. You may be on a train and doing something, but you're not actually going to a destination. Or, maybe it's the empty chairs there, where there's a place to sit, but there's not clarity on where to go. The empty signs in a station, how is that what it feels like? And we could go on, but the reality is what this leads us to is really this idea. These are two critical questions for every church that leaders need to be asking themselves every day. Do our stations connect people to our trains? And do our trains take people to our intended destinations? Are our stations, our waypoints, actually connecting people to our trains, our constants, those ongoing habits, those ongoing engagements that are going to be helps for them to grow? And then are those trains taking people to the intended destinations that we feel called to, specifically in our context and in our vision and what we're trying to shepherd people toward in our churches? These ultimately are the two critical health indicators that tell us, are we spending time on the right things? And are we going deeply in figuring out what the next step should be with our people based on where they actually are?
So Clint,
And so, yeah,
Clint,
yeah,
jump back to that slide.
yeah.
This metaphor is it's so robust. And help me just translate this. So our stations, our waypoints, these are ministries like a new 4-week new member experience, or
Mhm.
a welcome to a small group, kind of thing where we help people connect people. These are limited events that happen one time or short duration that are meant to connect people to ongoing ministries like a small group or a class. Or am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Or ongoing habits in their life. So there can be some things that we do that focus in on something, but ultimately we want them to shepherd people into a next step for their lives that becomes ongoing. Because that's the idea of discipleship, isn't it? And especially as we're training people, as we desire to multiply disciple making, there's certain competencies and intentionalities and sensitivities that we're trying to nurture in people's lives. And normally it doesn't work if you just have an event and are doing all kinds of fun stuff, but then you're just telling people, do this, get into this. There'll always be a few who respond, but in a widespread way, a lot of times, if we're not designing our system right, our underground system right, based on what people are, you're not providing next steps that make sense to them, which is why so many times we only have a few engaging in those next steps, in those next constants, in those next trains, getting on the right trains versus
Got it.
a widespread majority. Yeah. Does that help a little?
Come on, this is great.
Yeah. And the second question, do our trains actually take people to our intended destinations? Are the things that we're asking them to do in an ongoing way actually leading them closer to those outcomes in their lives? Are they actually resulting in those outcomes in their lives in a meaningful way? Because we have to go there. Otherwise, if we don't go in there in our thinking, it sort of is like we might put people on a train, but then there's washed out tracks along the way because we haven't done the due diligence to figure out what are the journeys that those people need, what are the right things that they need, and we assume it's going to work fine even with washed out train tracks. Or we experience some of those other things we looked at a moment ago, where it goes in circles, or it winds around, or it goes off in the distance. It really helps us lean into much more intentionality about how we're connecting our waypoints and constants that result in people growing in those outcomes in their lives.
Love it, Clint. Keep us going.
So I want us to spend the rest of our time to say, hey, how do we start addressing all of this? How do we actually answer those two questions? And for our purposes today, and again, the book goes into a lot more detail. It gives wonderful examples from many churches, gives wonderful examples of how to look at this, how to talk about this in your leadership team meetings in a way that's kind of a step by step and that doesn't feel like a model. It feels like a way of thinking that helps us work within what we're doing in an existing way and to improve it as we go. But there's three things I specifically wanted to talk about today. The first is in answering the questions, you want to start by defining your outcome expressions. Now, what outcome expressions are, and I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of those in a minute, those are those much more specific personal attributes that we're growing in over a period of time. So many churches, and in fact, many churches that we've worked with at Oxano, they might have a vision frame, and you've probably recognized some of my description of outcomes as being what Oxano historically is called measures, or marks or missional marks, and those are phenomenal to have as a starting point. What I'm suggesting is, I think in our complex society today and what we're dealing with in our culture, that we need more specificity than that. We need to be able to double click on it and get extremely real and kind of in the trenches with people. Hey, what does that translate into day in and day out? Because we don't want people nodding with us about our outcomes when we preach on them or talk about them, but then it doesn't really make sense to them in their everyday life. That's why we struggle with discipleship multiplication. So first thing we have to do is do a double click and get really specific about those expressions. I'll show you those in a second. Secondly, we want to seek baseline awareness of where our entire congregation is. And so the way that looks is there's what we call a Mind the Gap congregational survey. Now this is not your mama's survey. This is not, think of any survey you've done before. This is not like that one, I promise you. This one is something that we would want to actually set up. It would include the outcome expressions related to the different outcomes that we've defined in our church. This is what we have God, this is what God we sense is leading us toward, that we want to shepherd people toward. And all of that is in here, and people will answer kind of on this always to never scale. And again, when I show these to you, you'll see these are not legalistic things. These are things that are much more contemplative, that are much more journey based. And it gets people thinking, are these things that I'm in a pattern of engaging in always or often in my life, or is it only sometimes, or is it really rarely or never? As we talk about the survey, I'd encourage lead pastors who may be introducing this over a series of weeks in a sermon series to kind of equip their people to be open and honest and to let it be an act of worship. And I encourage the pastor, find a couple of things on this survey that you're not doing right now. And most of them, once this is all defined out, most of them say, well, that won't be hard. There'll be some things on here I can find. And actually say, hey, as you're going through it, give the congregation a couple of examples and say, I'm marking never on that one. Because right now, I'm not ever doing that. Even though I've intended to do that, I've been meaning to, I'm really not. And so what it does is it gives you this beautiful baseline awareness of where different groups in your church actually stand today. And then you want to begin taking steps toward building a culture of connectivity, where in your leadership team meetings and the way that you meet and the way that you think about designing ministry in different ministry seasons relates to this idea of connecting the right trains to the right stations. And I'm going to give you some very specific examples of that here in just a second. So let's start with the idea of outcome expressions. So again, as I just mentioned, the journey outcomes, or the outcomes for short, are your shared destinations that you're moving toward. All right, those are the destinations that we're seeking in somebody's life as to engage in. Outcome expressions explain what it means to live each one of those outcomes out personally. And so there are a lot of churches that will have kind of a main outcome. Maybe it's related to sharing your life story with others. But then they'll have maybe 4 or 5 or 6 I statements, first person statements underneath that starts to get much more specific about what it means. And those will be in areas like foundational disciplines, spiritual sensitivities, or missional intentionalities. And so let me give you a few examples of these. First, let me give you some examples from a church that stated their primary outcome. They used a role approach. And so this is a church that says, hey, if we are on mission here, we're going to be growing in our posture as a learner, as a builder, as an ambassador. They use roles like that. And then they attach one question behind it. So in this church's case, it's learner. How am I moving closer to God today? Now, they put weight on the foundational disciplines for their outcome expressions for this particular outcome. So these are just 3. I think they had 5 or 6 at least bullets beneath the idea of learner. But you'll see this begins to define more of the discipleship pathway that they're trying to shepherd. So this is where they said, okay, we're going to lean into some foundational disciplines on this one. I set aside daily time to study the Bible, to seek how God wants me to interact with others. I find myself briefly praying throughout my day to seek God's direction. I intentionally watch for the movement of God around me so I can join him in what he is doing. And again, I think they've got 3 more. But what it starts to do is it starts to begin to help someone think, am I doing these things on a regular basis? They're going to lead me to something more. Where am I? Am I often or always leaning into these? And that's where we want to be as a church, right? As we're shepherding people who are engaged with us, we want to shepherd people toward always or often growing in these kinds of areas. Let me show you. Let me show you a different one. This is another church. They didn't use roles, but they did use the question kind of as their umbrella statements for their outcomes. Here's a church that had 2 questions: what is hiding in my heart, and who am I inviting to the party? They have about 3 other core outcome questions as well, but these are just 2 of them. And I'm just showing you a couple of the outcome expressions underneath each of them. Again, they had a whole lot more. But look at this idea of answering what is hiding in my heart. It isn't just stopping there. So many churches that will get specific on their outcomes will have something like, hey, what is hiding in my heart? Or they might have more of a general statement of a fruit of the Spirit. But where this gets more specific, really starts to help us plan ministry so much better based on where people are or aren't. I know God well enough to distinguish between his truth and other things I see, hear, or think. In our world today, where there's a constant barrage of information coming at us, if I were to honestly, openly, in front of a holy God say, hey, God, do I really know you well enough? I'm not worried about Mike on this one. I'm not worried about someone sitting next to me. I'm not worried about other people. But in my life, do I really know him well enough to distinguish between what he has for me and how to filter the other things I see, hear, or think? That starts to posture some interesting questions for me. And so do I always, or can I respond always or often to this? I don't have secrets, and I'm open about my brokenness with myself and trusted friends. So here's where they're starting to go down a road with outcome expressions that are going to ultimately lead to the kind of community that they're seeking within their church context. And again, they've got several others. This who am I inviting to the party idea? I'm deliberate about making unchurched friends where I live, work, and play. In their context, what they realized when they did this survey actually in their church was they thought a lot of their people were doing this, but the results came back and they really weren't. And they were able to see marked differences in different demographics of the church. Some are doing certain things, some aren't doing certain things. Then it's exciting because you get to figure out why. And I'll show you a system that helps you do that. Sometimes churches will put something as specific as inviting people.
I love these examples. Like, as I think about these in my life, like if my church engaged these, I can see these pushing me forward and giving him that data, right? So once you get, I love the 2 examples you've shared. how do you now once you have this, and I know you give other examples here, but how do we get that baseline awareness? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah. So that's I do want to point out a couple things here really quickly, and then I'll jump straight to that. We can get even more specific with these based on the unique context and vision at the church. So what I was just showing you were examples of some foundational disciplines, starting to get into spiritual sensitivities. But when you get into missional intentionality, as you skim some of these, you're going to see some language that's based upon some very specific initiatives. Some of you may recognize the term horizon storyline of looking short term and long term. That starts to really get specific related to the disciple making multiplication that that particular church is seeking. And so as you do this, you use the survey in the way I described a second ago, to find out where your people are. You set it up as really an act of worship where people are open and honest in front of God as they respond to this. It's anonymous, it's confidential. But as they do this, it's giving the leadership of the church an extremely good picture that's just baseline awareness. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you how we get ongoing awareness. So it's a beautiful thing. You do these kinds of surveys to get baseline awareness, then you can emphasize certain things in the way you're redesigning certain waypoints and constants and what you're doing in those. And then you can go back and retest just those few I statements and see, over this 6 month or 9 month period where we've really leaned into certain things, is it moving the needle in people's lives? And you can actually see it move. And so the beauty of using a congregational survey at this point, once you've established your expressions, is it explores that the backgrounds of your people and the fruit based on your church's unique context. This is 100% designed for you and your church. It clarifies your people's challenges throughout the church, and it gives you in blinking light fashion where your connectivity gaps are between waypoints and constants. And so here's the deal. Once you have the results of this, it's pretty amazing. And by the way, you can do this on your own. The book walks you through how to create this on your own. So this is not necessarily something that you have to work with Oksana on, although we do these. And for many churches, it helps them to have someone guiding them through this and doing the crunching of the data and providing reports and next steps. And so we're available to you to lean into this, but you can do it on your own. But as you work through it, and once you have that baseline awareness, then the question is, well, now what do we do, right? And so this is where we have to be intentional about establishing a culture of connectivity. And so there's three quick things that I want to share with you. One is you want to begin by evaluating your current ministries using criteria for waypoints and constants. So in the book, there's several chapters on this. There's a grid, the whole bit. It walks you through tests that you can use when you're seeing some potential issues with waypoints. So let's say you do the survey and some things that you thought were working, you find out really aren't. Well, the tests, the criteria give you a way to lean in and figure out why. Also, you'll want to start thinking in terms of your groups of existing lay leaders. So all of us have those in our churches, right? There's different groups of people who are core, who are very involved with us, but you want to go deeper in the kind of involvement, deeper in the way they're thinking about connectivity. And I'll give you a construct for that here in a second. And then you want to engage what I call a checkup loop. This is what gives you ongoing awareness when you're testing things, trying things, experimenting with things as you go. And so let me share some of these examples with you. The criteria, the tests, and again, you'll see this in the book. There's 5 that apply to all ministries. There's 3 specifically for your waypoints and constants. A couple of examples, the empathy test. How well does this show appreciation for where people are when they first engage? I could share story after story with you of churches that have done a waypoint, and later they found out that people weren't connecting, and it was because they weren't doing the advanced research to even know where their people were coming into the room. I could share heartbreaking examples of this in group settings or in trying to reach out to the community where the people who they were able to get to come completely didn't connect, didn't even want to darken the doors of the church again because they so missed where the people were. They used the wrong language, they spent the wrong time on things. It's not a heart issue. It wasn't an intentionality issue, but it was a reality that they weren't able to get to. The continuity test, as you begin to think about waypoints, how well does this actually lead someone to commit to a new constant? There's this cool potentiality test to help people think in terms of, is this an outcome I even want in my life? Is this a train I even want to get on? How do we actually figure out how to design things to make that work? The expectancy test is another example. How well is this designed with the participants' probable future in mind? One church that had a whole bunch of different groups, and a lot of them were gender-based. And they said, gosh, we're a church that's all about marriage and families. And we began probing this, and they realized that their gender-based Bible studies and groups were actually working against the idea of family because they had a lot of, in this particular church, they happened to have a lot of women whose husbands weren't attending church with them. And so what was happening is these women were getting into these gender-based groups and were building all of this deep relationship and friendship and spiritual engagement. And essentially they were building it in such a way that it was blocking the husband from ever engaging with them in that. And it was kind of this watershed moment for them. Those are the kinds of things that these tests help churches to identify. The second thing I mentioned, I want to throw out this idea of meta partnering. And meta, I love using this word, this term meta here. Meta, similar to the idea of metaphysics. It's more all encompassing. It's more of looking at all of the different pieces of what we're doing. We want to lean into this idea. It's kind of like we talk about the meta narrative of scripture, of how things are wired and how they connect, more transcendent in the way we look at stuff. And so as we work with our existing groups of lay leaders, we want to seek out and nurture those lay leaders who tend to be close, curious, and collaborative. We want to grow these attributes in their life as we train our lay leaders, because we want them with us on this journey. We want them with us in thinking, how are our waypoints and constants connecting to the destinations that we have for people? And so the 3 C's are close, curious, and collaborative. We want our partners, our meta partners, to be close to us and to the mission of the church, to the calling for these outcome expressions, but we also want them to be close to the people on the ground throughout our church. And so remember, the congregational survey gave us a snapshot. It gives us baseline awareness, but meta partnering, if we get our meta partners who are close to the people on the ground on a weekly basis or regular basis, it gives us field researchers, so to speak. It gives us people in the field who can help us in real time ask questions, experiment with things, get feedback on specific reasons why there's certain barriers to things. We also want them to be curious. So we have to foster this deep curiosity. We don't want lay leaders to just be volunteers doing certain things at certain times. We want them to be curious with us about what is it? What are the real whys behind why people are struggling with certain things? And there's a lot of creative ways we can do that. Again, the book gives many steps, many specific questions and chapters on going through this. And then we want them to be collaborative. We don't want lone rangers. We don't want people who said, I'll just do this on my own. I'll just get it out there. That's neither biblical nor is it consistent with what we're trying to grow in our churches. And so what if we're able to foster this kind of cool dynamic between our groups of lay leaders that goes deeper in the training toward multiplication by collaborating together with what is working and what isn't? And the way we do that is through what I call a checkup loop. And so this is something that's based upon organizational theory and process improvement. And again, is very, very biblical. It relates back even to the occupations those ancient occupations that we talked about that are represented over and over in leadership in the Bible. And it's this kind of 5-step checkup loop that helps us determine, again, what are the real whys. So once we have the baseline awareness, now we want to find out the real whys. Meaning why are people actually struggling with certain things, and then to test and to try different things. And so the checkup loop, it's a 5-step process where you actually are meeting with your group. So let's pretend this is our lay leaders of groups within our church. They could be serve teams, or they could be smaller missional groups, for example, or groups that are doing life together. So most of you have some kind of group ministry like that. Well, let's start with all of the lay leaders who are leading those groups within our church. And let's begin to nurture them over a period of time around our outcome expressions so that they're close, they're curious, they're collaborative with us. We share with them the results of our survey. And now we say, hey guys, why don't we start by learning more about this one? Hey team, what, as we've talked about, as we've all seen, we are incredibly curious about why our people are struggling with this area in these 3 or 4 outcome expressions. And so what is it that we could do? How could we go back next week into our groups and ask them some very specific questions about why that is? And so again, the book does go into specifics. How do you begin to peel that onion? Not just say, hey, why aren't you sharing your faith? Okay, that's not the approach to take. It's because usually people are just going to respond a little more defensively. It's going to be more like, hey, what we learned from this particular statement on the survey was a lot of our people are struggling with this specific aspect. Now, let's talk about that more. And so you actually talk with your meta partners about what creative ways are to talk with your people where they are. So this is a beautiful thing because it doesn't feel like a cookbook. It doesn't feel like you're taking something off the shelf from somewhere else and trying to just force it in. You're actually designing the questions that they're going to go and ask and the discussion that they're going to facilitate within the different relationships they already have. Now, remember, these are people who are close to the people throughout the church. So they already have a relationship where they can get that information in a lot more straightforward way. And it can be just this wonderful thing. So you send them out to do this research. It doesn't have to be hard. You just need to prepare them well and consistently. Then you get back together. Again, you're doing this anyway. You have ways to communicate. This could be one-on-one, if these are smaller groups of leaders or meta partners that you're sending out kind of like a SWAT team, or it could be all together in a regular rhythm of meeting, which you may be doing anyway. So you'll want it to fit your normal rhythm. But that's where you'll begin to capture some themes, because you'll start to see some things that repeat themselves that you're hearing from your different meta partners as they go out to research. And then you're going to together determine what the next step is. What is the next move? And again, there are very specific ways that the book walks through to help you come up with what's a good next move that doesn't feel like a puzzling leap, or it doesn't feel like you're stepping into a gap, or it doesn't feel like we're saying, get on this train over there that actually is a mile away and there's no stations or signs along the way to get you there. You're able to very clearly know, oh, because you've heard from people, you've heard from your meta partners, oh, let's do this in the next 30 days. And you're doing it within your existing context. And then you evaluate, you assess the results to plan your next move. So you're in this beautiful rhythm of focusing, sending, synthesizing, acting, and evaluating as you engage with your lay leaders in a deeper way.
So Clint, I love this. So what are next steps? Like now you've kind of walked through this, and there's been a lot of great content here. What's next?
Yeah. So if any of this interests you, I would pre-order the book. The release is April 11th. And so I'd encourage you to pre-order it, to check it out and share it in your circles. If you like it, and if you find it's a helpful resource, would love it if you might consider leaving a 5-star review on Amazon, and let us know if you need help. The book is something that is written in a way to let you do much of this on your own. It gives you step-by-step approaches to begin integrating this into what you're doing. So it's designed in a way to help you think and to give you the kind of mindset to move forward, because every church already has trains, every church already has stations. Every church already has some form of destinations they're going for. What the book does is it helps you get more specific about what those need to be and how well they're working toward the specific destinations you're trying to shepherd people toward. But we're always available to help if you need it. So it's really a good place to start to look at those three things, Mike.
I love that. I love that. Everyone who's on the webinar today, thank you for coming. If you have questions, you can type those in the chat. If you have any other, want to explore this more, go to mindthegap.com. You will find more information about the book, some of those reviews that folks who have had a chance to have early access to the book have found it's been tremendously helpful for them in closing the gap between what we're doing and the outcomes that we're getting. So thank you everyone today for joining us on our Clarity First webinar going over Mind the Gap. We'll see you next time.